Gadone mentioned that I came right up to him on the walls of Jerusalem to say I was interested in this idea. I'd been prepared to hear that idea probably for about 6 months. Part of that preparation I will cover in some of my remarks later. But there's one thing he left out. Not only did he say this idea just came to me in the last day or so, but he also said, and my wife said, this is probably the best idea I've ever had. So, bells went off. No, it was God's idea, actually. Well, I am pleased to be able to speak with you about the blood moons tonight. I'm going to take you from ground zero for those that are on live stream and you've seen my 6-part course, the 3-hour course. Yes, you will hear some of that again. I will be summarizing that. I'll be touching on some high points. I'll throw in a few things you haven't heard. But we will get to some things that nobody has heard except for very few people. Thule, Gadone, and Mark Biltz knows what I'm going to cover tonight. I will cover the history of the blood moon. So I'll take you from ground zero. You do not have to know the subject. And I'll do it quickly. I have a way, I think I can do it efficiently. I'm going to tell you the story of my involvement in the blood moons. I will propose the blood moons as a gift to Jews, and I'll explain in detail why I think it fits as a gift from God. And I'd like to offer a surprise. All right, so let's start with the history of the blood moons. This is Mark Biltz. I just mentioned his name. Every discovery has a story, and it's important, I think, to understand the story behind the discovery. So where did the blood moons come from? The story began with Mark Biltz, Christian pastor in Tacoma, Washington. He has a strong appreciation for Israel, Jews, Torah. He teaches a Hebrew roots friendly congregation there. And he has some Jewish heritage. He's not a Jew, didn't claim to be a Jew. He's, I think one of his grandparents is half Jew. And he had some Jewish heritage being passed down in the family. In 2008, shortly after Mark started this congregation in Tacoma, Washington, he got on the internet and he liked astronomy and so forth, and he found a live feed, actually a replay, I think, of the live feed of a total lunar eclipse that was appearing over the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And he saw that on his computer. And just a reminder, what is a lunar eclipse? It's when the moon passes into the Earth's shadow, the shadow there, the umbra shadow. That's where the moon will turn a color, some shade of red. You never know what's going to happen when it goes into the shadow. Why is that? Because if you're on that moon and you're looking back, what do you see? You're seeing the Earth covering the sun. And around that Earth, you're going to see a ring of light, where you're looking simultaneously at every sunset and sunrise happening on the Earth. And depending on whether it's cloudy on those sunsets and sunrises or clear, you get different shades of color. But sometimes it can be very red. And he had a pretty red moon on that evening. So that's a lunar eclipse. And being a little bit more of a scientific guy, he got onto the NASA website that tracks all kinds of lunar eclipses. He looked and he found on the table, okay, so let's see, this eclipse was on February 21st, 2008. And so you see the little T there with the yellow shading. That T just stands for total. It's the kind of eclipse there was. You can have partial eclipses and penumbral eclipses and so forth. But the total ones are the ones that really bring the most attention. And so, having seen that, he writes in his book, I've read all the Bible verses in Isaiah, Joel, the Gospels, and Revelation, where the text talks about the moon turning to blood and the sun turning to sackcloth. And I began to ponder the possibilities of tying the eclipses mentioned in the Bible to the possible coming of the Messiah. So that was the discoverer with the seed idea of what this thing might mean. So is there any wonder why today the blood moons are associated with sort of end times kinds of things, right? Okay, so that was his thought. So if that was his thought, and he's a future-looking guy, he likes end-time prophecies and things like this, he said, okay, when's it going to happen next? So he looked in these tables and he scanned down, and you can scan down as he did, and see, why look, there in 2014 and 2015, there are 4 T's in a row for total lunar eclipses. And science calls that a tetrad. Tetrad comes from the number, word 4. And 4 lunar eclipses is the most you can have in succession. Never have 5, you can have 3, 2, or 1. But 4 is the most. And when they happen like this, there's nothing in between. There's no partial eclipses or anything else. It's just 4 total lunar eclipses. And he said, okay, that's interesting. And being sort of a Hebrew roots kind of a Christian, he looked over and saw the dates over there and said, I wonder if that April 15th might be Passover, or that October 8th, why that might even be Sukkot. So we went to a Hebrew calculator, a calendar calculator, and did the conversion. And lo and behold, sure enough, on those 4 lunar eclipses, they all fell on Jewish feast days. Passover, Sukkot, Passover, Sukkot. And so that was, okay, that's interesting. That's really interesting, actually. And so Mark decided to call this thing a blood moon tetrad. Okay, so he was thinking of that scripture about the moon turning to blood, and so he named it. That's, discoverers get that prerogative, you know, if their names are the ones that often stick. So he asked himself, when has this ever happened before? So he looked back, and there have been multiple tetrads in the 1900s, quite a few, 7 or 8, I think. But so he used his Hebrew calculator and a calendar converter and found out which ones were falling on Jewish feast days, and this is what he found. He found that it was happening in 1967 and 1968. And he said, well, I know some important things that happened in those years. And then 1949 and 50, well, that sure is interesting. It's very close to 1948. And then he went back and he had to go a long, long, long way to find the next one. And he went all the way back and he found it in 1493 and 1494. And when he found these things, he said his jaw dropped open, could not believe it. This seems like this is more than coincidence. And there must be something going on here. Okay. So that was in 2008. And he began talking about it openly. Did some DVDs, shared about it. But the term blood moon really didn't take hold in a big way until John Hagee took it on, because he learned about the blood moons from Mark Biltz. He was up visiting Mark Biltz at a night to honor Israel, a Kufi event, Christians United for Israel, and learned of it and went back and studied. He got excited about it too. And so now, since 2012 and John Hagee, millions of people have heard this term, especially Christians, but even non-Christians. Even now when you go and look at the secular media and talk about lunar eclipses, a lunar eclipse, they'll say, oh, a blood moon is coming up, you know, this next month. So the term has caught even beyond Christian circles. But mostly Christian circles understand the term. And in November of 2012, John Hagee, after learning about us and studying it some on his own, preached a sermon series that began in November 2012, and I think the tagline, if I recall correctly, on that sermon series was "Something is about to change." So notice he backed off. He wasn't saying exactly what's going to happen, but you know, based on past patterns, this stuff looks important. Something's going to happen. All right. And for both John and Mark Biltz, the key verse, the foundational verse for all of this work was Joel 3:4 in the Hebrew Bible, or Joel 2:31 as we know it in the English Bible. And the sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord come. You don't have the word lunar eclipse in the Bible, but you do have this moon into blood. Okay, so that has been used extensively It happens, but it's not only in Joel. It happens. It's in multiple places, also in the New Testament. So many Christians began speculating on the meaning of these blood moons with this pattern. And I'd like to just give you an overview of like what are the main things that Christians are saying about it, just so you know. People are saying a lot of different things, but if you boil it down to the main points, war's coming to Israel because of the past patterns. Even back at, in 1493-94, you have the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. So it wasn't a war, but it was certainly a difficult event, a horrific event. Then, so war coming to Israel has been a common theme that's been put forth by Christians. Judgment of the nations. Of course, that's quickly followed by, if any nation turns against Israel, then God will turn against that nation. I mean, we know that you don't need a blood moon to tell us that, but that the idea that there may be something happening with regard to that is a common view. In other words, the day of the Lord, well, that's right in the Scripture. If these things happen before the great and terrible day of the Lord happens, then the day of the Lord may be coming. And of course, the speculations about the Messiah not far behind. I don't have any issue with any of this. It's all in Scripture. Things will happen. We all believe. Everyone here in this room believes Messiah will come. But I'm just trying to give you an overview of how it's been viewed. Now, a couple other things. I'd like to give 3 other points from Mark Biltz and what he sees as the meaning. They go beyond just what everybody is saying. I think he makes 3 very good points. I just like to cover them here before I start to tell you my view. These 3 things I think are excellent points. First is that the blood moons force Christians to recognize Jewish feast days as important. If you have a Jewish mindset and you're a Jew, and it's hard to understand, but just the whole Christian calendar thing, and this is a big move for us to make this leap, to start to look at the Jewish feast days. Secondly, it's helping people understand that God's calendar is on the Jewish calendar. So if these things are important because they're following on the Jewish calendar, then that says that God has interest and God cares about the Jewish calendar. That's His calendar. So that's another thing that is sort of seeped into the Christian mindset, I think. And the third thing is, as he says, it should encourage people everywhere to get right with God. So no problem with any of those things. All right. Now I'd like to tell you the story of my involvement in blood moons, because you won't understand my view on it until I put myself in the story a little bit. So my story begins in November 2012. That's when John Hagee taught his sermon series. And my sister lives in San Antonio, and during that time she does not go to Cornerstone Church, but doesn't live too far away from there, and just felt a nudging. I think I need to go there this Sunday. So she went in, just popped in, and he was teaching this. I think he was part 2 of the sermon series on this. So she got out of that, and she called me up that day and said, Bob, you've got to hear this. This is really this thing called, I think it's a tetrad or something, and these blood moons. You've got to check this out. Of course, she knew I had 35 years in observational astronomy. I'd done solar and lunar eclipses. I'd absorbed all this stuff, and been a lot of involvement with astronomy over the years. So she expected that I would pick it right up. And I tell you what I did with her recommendation. I did absolutely nothing. Did not do anything with it. And I was involved in other things. I don't know. But it wasn't until January 21st. She actually gave me DVDs over Christmas, I think. And so in case I would actually decide to watch. So I finally picked up some DVDs on January 21st. Why do I know this date? It's because I keep a journal. And I tell my Christian listeners, everybody ought to keep a journal of things that happen to you. Because you never know when it's going to be interesting later. So I watched these DVDs, and of course, with my understanding of solar and lunar eclipses and stuff, I clicked in and kind of knew where this was coming from. And then it was the next day, I think, except I don't know if it was the next day or the next week because I didn't write this one in my journal. So I saw something. I saw something really, really interesting. I saw that the lunar eclipses that were talked about, there was a solar eclipse put in there, and that the solar eclipse was actually much rarer than the blood moons were. And why was it rarer than the blood moons? Because from the NASA data, even though it really wasn't obvious just looking at it, but by piecing some things together and my knowledge of astronomy, I could tell this thing was going to end right at the North Pole. The path on the Earth of the shadow was going to skim the North Atlantic Ocean and end right at the North Pole. Now, I knew that would be rare in its own. Pick any spot on the Earth. Pick Jerusalem. How often should Jerusalem have a total solar eclipse go across it? Average for any spot on the Earth is about every 300 years. So it's even rarer than blood moons. Blood moons happen on average about every 200 years. But here was the most interesting thing. This total eclipse at the North Pole was going to happen on March 20th, which was the day that Nisan 1 was going to begin for that year, and it was the day that spring was going to begin. There is no need for Nisan 1 to occur on the first day of spring. You've got solar and lunar calendars coming together. Okay, so, and for this to happen at the North Pole. So I knew this must be extremely rare. So how rare? About every 100,000 years. So, and what we have here, because the sun is being eclipsed on the first day of spring at the North Pole, you know the North Pole, it has 6 months of light and 6 months of darkness, right? So we're talking about a solar eclipse at sunrise, when for the 6 months long daytime. The solar eclipse is occurring right at the moment of sunrise, first day of spring at the North Pole. And it's going to be eclipsed for 2 minutes. That's in that particular eclipse is 2 minutes on March 20th. And something like this should happen only once every 100,000 years. But you add to the fact that this is happening now on Nisan 1, you add the Jewish feast day, or the Jewish day component to it, the biblical New Year, and really, it's the first time ever. So, I was really, really excited when I discovered this, and looking at the blood moons material. And let's see if I can just do a quick play here. What we did give you a chance to see what this would look like. This is the closest thing I can approximate to what it would look like at the North Pole. This is a time lapse, so you've got the shadow going across. The sun now is already a total eclipse. It's a little bit above the horizon because this is on Svalbard. It's actually the most northerly land on the path. It's not at the North Pole. If it's the North Pole, it would be right at the horizon. And we had at Root Source, Godon selected Isaiah 11:9 as a call to prayer. So we asked Christians and Jews to come together and to pray that verse on behalf of the world. So that was a month ago. It seems like much longer than that. So, all right, so that lit my fire. Discovering something that rare, what could God be saying? What could the blood moons mean? Absolutely. Now we're not talking about a match. We're talking about, dry kindling, and the fire started. So over the next months, February through May, I put significant time on this. Ask my wife. I put hundreds of hours on this. I was looking at all of the prophecies, both the scripture and the various views on it, Christian views. I was looking at history of all the dates of these various blood moons, Israel, Jewish studies, and astronomy. And it's just as my own personal crash course. I just went in every different direction. I probably in this time period, I probably read about 50 books in that period. And I only had one problem with the blood moons after I spent all of that significant time on it. And the problem was that the key verse contradicted the theory. What do I mean by that? Well, this foundational verse that's been used everywhere is that the sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord. And the problem I had with it was the facts. If you look at the 1492 was a terrible day. No doubt, the expulsion of Jews from Spain. But the blood moons were happening after it, not before it. And then you have in Israel becoming a nation in 1948, what a great day that was. And you even had some difficulty. You have the Independence War. But it's almost all of that is happening before the blood moons even started. A year before. Then you have the Six-Day War in 1967, and yeah, that was a very key event, and that did happen during the blood moons. But it started between the first and second of the blood moons. So 3/4 of this whole phenomena is occurring after it. And of course, now we're to the point where we can say, there hasn't been a terrible day of the Lord to the extent of anything, like what's occurred here. So if something does happen, then yeah, I guess you can say that the blood moons happened before something. Something will happen someday, right? So the blood moons happen. But the problem I had was, well, then what's the basis for that if you look at the past history? So I've talked to a lot of Christians about this, and some say, look, don't be so precise. They're in the same neighborhood of time. I don't know. But I just have such a profound appreciation for God, and from what I've learned with the Jewish studies and the precision of the meaning of the words and so forth, and it just bothered me, right? Well, that was one big problem I had. Another problem I had was that nobody was proposing explanations for the earlier blood moon tetrads. So the earliest was not 1493 and 94. It went back in 1428, and then 860, and 842, and 795, and 162. And the authors admitted that there wasn't any great explanations for those early dates. And, I graduated in computer science years ago. I mean, when you take your science classes, you just don't get to throw out half the data. You're just not supposed to do that. So I looked at it. I spent a lot of time in history. I spent a lot of time in history about these dates. Okay, it seems like something's here, right? But how does it fit? So I spent a lot of time on that, and I couldn't find out. I couldn't figure out anything. I had no great idea during that period of time. Okay, well, there was one sort of last diving catch that I was thinking about and that others had proposed, and that is to make this scripture work, for the blood moons to happen before the great and terrible day of the Lord. And that's take them all as a group. Let's take them all, okay, they're all there, and they've all happened over the years, and they're all coming together, and they're happening before the great and terrible day of the Lord. That's what we got. 5 months to go for that possibility. After Sukkot, we would know that this diagram would be true. But there was a problem with that too. I had a problem with that. You know what that was? There's more blood moon tetrads coming. Now, they're not coming for a while. We're not going to be alive when they come. There's 500 years and 600 years from now. But I just struggled with that. If this great and terrible day of the Lord comes and Messiah comes and we got 1,000 years of righteousness on the earth and so forth, to have another blood moons tetrad happen in the middle of that, I'm just struggling with that as what do I do with that? That there's going to be some, and then some Christians would say, now come on, Bob, look, the rules will be different in the millennium. You can't ascribe the same meaning to them. So, but anyway, I got to the end of this period, and I just wasn't working. As a scientist, as someone who believes in the value and the precision and wonder of God, it just wasn't working. So, I need to tell you what happened next. And over the next few months. And I'm going to black the screen for this for a minute, just to speak from the heart. I would rather not have to tell you about this, but you won't understand what I'm going to say next to the level. So I feel like I need to tell you this personal story. As I was going through all of this study and history and so forth, all these books, I would read books from a Jewish perspective, from a Christian perspective, both Protestant perspective, from Catholic perspective, looking at history. I was trying to figure out what's going on. What could God be wanting to say through these bloodlines? And every time I got into one of these books, they would cover Jewish persecution. They would cover acts that were done to Jews. And every time I came across one of them, I would just put it in an Excel sheet that I had my Excel for that. And every book was coming up with different stories. I mean, it was different events. So when I would read a different book, 3/4 or 80% of them would be different than the last one. And I had a general sense that this Excel sheet was growing. I wasn't actually studying them, but I was just putting the things in there. I tried to put the date. I would try to put the type of event, whether it was a pogrom, whether it was a church father who was writing, had an anti-Semitic writing, whether it was a church council that was restricting freedom for Jews, whether it was some event where some Jew gets accused and lynched and all this, and also all of the different kinds of events that were out there. And if it was a pogrom or whatever, I would look for the data, and also to see how many lives were lost, how many Jewish lives were lost. So I had this data, but it was just sort of collecting there. And when middle of July came in 2015, the 9th of August coming up,